They told you she ran out of fuel. They lied. I was the radio man on duty that night, and what Amelia Earhart described wasn't a crash, it was a harvest. This is the classified truth behind the final flight of the Electra and the secret of Project Aquila. Subscribe now to join our search for the truth they buried. Let's dive into the transmission that was never meant to be heard. The heat in the shack was not just a temperature, it was a weight. It sat on my shoulders like a wet wool blanket, pressing me down into the hard wooden chair. I was stationed on the edge of the world, or at least it felt that way. The island was a speck of dirt in an endless stretch of blue water, and my entire life had shrunk down to the size of this radio room. It was a box of unpainted timber and corrugated iron, baking under the Pacific sun until the air inside shimmered. There was no breeze that day. The palms outside hung limp and dead still, as if the wind itself had been frightened away. Remember the sweat running down my back. It trickled like crawling insects, soaking into the waist of my trousers. I wiped my forehead with a rag that was already damp, leaving a streak of grease on the logbook. The paper was curling at the edges, warping from the humidity. Every movement I made felt slow, as though I were moving through syrup. My job was to listen. That was it. I was to sit in the stifling warmth and listen to the voice of the sky, waiting for a woman who was trying to circle the earth. For hours, there had been nothing but the white noise. It is a sound that gets inside your teeth. It is the sound of the ocean, but sharper. A ceaseless hissing that fills the ears and numbs the mind. We call it static, but out there, alone in the middle of the great water, it felt more like the breathing of a sleeping beast. I stared at the dials on the receiver. The needles twitched now and then, dancing to the rhythm of storms brewing hundreds of miles away, but there was no voice, no pattern, just the chaos between the stars. I tried to reach the cutter ship, the Itasca. They were supposed to be the lighthouse for her, the guide to bring her home. I pressed the key, sending my own jagged bursts of sound out into the void. I asked for a position. I asked if they had heard her. The response was always the same, a garbled mess of confusion. They were shouting into the dark just like I was, and the dark was not answering. It felt wrong. The equipment was good. The tubes were glowing with a steady, warm orange light. The copper wires were secure. By all accounts, the air should have been full of chatter. But the silence between the bursts of static was heavy. It felt deliberate. Then the change began. It did not start with a sound, but with a feeling in my chest. The air in the room, which had been hot and thick, suddenly felt solid. It was the sensation you get when you dive deep into the lagoon, and the water presses in on your skull. My ears popped. A sharp click deep inside my head, yet I had not moved an inch. I swallowed hard, trying to clear the pressure, but it would not leave. It was as if the sky had lowered itself, crushing the roof of the shack. I looked around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, becoming longer and darker than the light from the bulbs should have allowed. I had spent 1,000 nights in radio shacks from the jungle to the desert, and I knew the feeling of isolation. But this was different. I felt exposed. The hair on my arms stood up, prickling against the damp skin. I had the distinct, crawling certainty that I was being watched. Not by the birds outside, and not by my commanding officer. It felt like something was looking down at me, peering through the tin roof as if it were made of glass. I gripped the edge of the desk. My knuckles turned white. The logical part of my mind, the part that knew how to solder wires and read maps, tried to find a reason. I told myself a storm front was collapsing, the atmosphere. I told myself the heat was finally cooking my brain. But deep down, in the animal part of my gut, I knew the air had changed because something massive had entered it. The drone of the static had been my only companion for hours. It was a consistent, rhythmic wash of noise. Then, in the space of a single heartbeat, it vanished. It did not fade out. It was cut. 1 second, the room was filled with the hissing of the universe, and the next, it was dead silent. The sudden lack of noise was violent. It hit me harder than a thunderclap. I reached for the dial, my fingers trembling. I spun it left, then right. I checked the connections. The tubes were still glowing that dull, angry orange. The power was running. The needle on the gauge sat perfectly still in the center, not quivering, not moving a fraction. It was impossible. Even on the clearest winter night, there is always background noise. The hum of the earth, the chatter of distant storms, the interference of the sun. But this was a vacuum. It was as if someone had reached out with a giant hand and pinched the wire that connected the world together. The receiver was open, the channel was clear, but the world had stopped speaking. I sat frozen in the chair, the sweat cooling on my neck, staring at the speaker mesh. The silence was not empty. It was waiting. It was a held breath before a scream. And in that impossible quiet, I realized that whatever was watching me had cleared the path for something to come through. The silence had lasted long enough to make my own heart sound like a drum beating against my ribs. I was staring at the mesh of the speaker, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, waiting for the world to start again. Then it happened. It did not come with a crackle or a pop. There was no fade in, no wrestling with the atmospheric haze. Her voice simply existed in the room. It cut through the dead air with a clarity that was impossible. It sounded as if she were standing right behind me, leaning over my shoulder, whispering directly into my ear. Calling Itasca. We must be on you, but cannot see you. I flinched. The sound was too sharp, too naked. Radio voices are supposed to be thin, tinny things, stripped of their humanity by the miles of wire and air they travel through. But this voice carried the wetness of a throat, the tremor of a lip. It was Amelia. I knew her tone from the newsreels and the previous check-ins. She was a woman of steel, a flyer who laughed at storms. But the voice that filled my wooden shack was brittle. It was the voice of someone holding onto their sanity with wet fingertips. I grabbed the pencil. My hand was shaking so bad the lead snapped on the page. I grabbed another. I wrote down what she said. But the words made no sense to a man who knew machines. She claimed the gas was holding. The needles on her fuel gauges were steady, showing plenty of juice to keep the propellers spinning. Yet, she said the engines were sputtering. She described a coughing sound, a hesitation in the rhythm of the flight, as if the motors were being choked by hands we could not see. I tried to reply. I keyed the mic, shouting my call sign, shouting for her to climb, to circle, to look for the smoke from the ship. But the needle on my output gauge didn't move. My voice was dying in the room. The radio was a one-way door, open only from her side. Gas is low, she said, contradicting herself from a moment before. We are running north and south. Her confusion bled through the speaker. She was reading coordinates, shouting out numbers from her charts. I traced them on my map with a trembling finger. I drew the line where she said she was. It put her nowhere. It put her in empty water where the Itasca should have been visible for miles. She was flying over a part of the map that I knew was empty. Yet she spoke as if she were lost in a maze. Then came the sound behind her voice, in the pauses between her words, when she stopped to gasp. For air, I heard it. It wasn't the wind rushing over the fuselage. It wasn't the roar of the twin wasps. It was a grinding noise. It sounded like two massive stones being rubbed together or heavy chains being dragged across a metal deck. It was a slow, rhythmic crunching that made my teeth ache. It sounded like the sky itself was chewing on the plane. The clouds. Her voice pitched up, tight with a panic that made my stomach turn over. The clouds are not right. They are glowing. There is a light inside them. I looked out the window of the shack. The Pacific sky was blue and hard, the sun blazing down. But she was describing a twilight. She said the clouds below her were boiling with a soft, milky luminescence. She said it wasn't the reflection of the sun, but a glow coming from deep within the vapor, like a lantern lit inside a ball of cotton. That was when the temperature in the shack broke. The stifling heat that had been crushing me all morning vanished in a second. It wasn't replaced by a cool breeze. It was replaced by a dead, heavy cold. It came up through the floorboards, a vibration that rattled the legs of the chair. It felt like standing on the deck of a ship when the great engines reverse, a deep shudder that travels through the bone. But this engine was beneath the island. The vibration hummed against the soles of my boots, numbing my toes. I looked at the glass of water sitting on the corner of the desk. The surface was rippling. Concentric circles appeared in the water, marching inward from the glass rim to the center. The cold intensified. It was the chill of a meat locker, the kind of cold that smells of iron and old blood. My breath plumed out in a white mist in front of my face. In Hawaii, in the middle of summer. "Fred!" Amelia's voice cracked. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was screaming at her navigator. "Fred, stop it! Look at the compass!" I heard a man's voice then. It was faint, distant, as if he were slumped in the back of the cockpit. He was screaming. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure, dissolving reason. He was shouting about the windows. He was shouting that the stars had moved. "The bear is gone?" I heard him wail, his voice distorted by the grinding background noise. "There is no north. The stars are all wrong." I stared at the logbook, the pencil hovering over the paper. It was day. The sun was high. They shouldn't be seeing stars at all. And even if they could, the stars do not move. They are the anchors, the only things a sailor or a pilot can trust. If the stars were wrong, then they weren't flying over the earth anymore. The cold vibration in the floor grew violent. The jars of screws on the shelf began to chatter, walking toward the edge. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear the headset off and bolt out into the jungle, into the heat and the light. But her voice held me there. It was a tether. I was the only witness to the impossible. "We are circling," she whispered, the panic suddenly dropping into a breathless awe. "It isn't an island, it's... Oh, sweet Lord, it's coming out of the water." The signal did not fade. The grinding noise swelled, louder and louder, until it drowned out the hum of the equipment in my room. The vibration traveled up my legs, seizing my knees, locking me in the chair. I was connected to her. I was falling with her. And whatever was rising from the ocean was coming for both of us. Her voice changed then. The panic that had been tearing at her throat a moment before was gone, replaced by a hollow, flat tone that was far worse. It was the sound a soldier makes when he sees the battlefield and realizes there is no way home. She told me she was looking down at the water, but the water was no longer acting like the ocean. She said the surface had broken open. "It is a ring," she whispered. "It is a great ring of white iron." I pressed the headset tighter against my ears until the plastic dug into my skin. Tried to picture a ship, a raft, anything that men could build. But she was not describing a hull or a deck. She described a perfect circle, a loop of blinding metal that had risen from the deep. She said it had no rivets. There were no seams where plates of steel had been welded together. It was one smooth, continuous piece, like a wedding band cast for a giant, shining with a light that hurt her eyes even from thousands of feet up. "The water is boiling," she said, "but there is no steam." I wrote that down, my hand cramping. Boiling without steam. It went against everything I knew about the world. When the sea heats up, it breathes. It throws mist into the air. But she said the ocean around this silver crown was thrashing and bubbling, churning white. Yet the air above it remained clear. The water lay flat and heavy, pressed down by an invisible weight, bubbling like oil in a hot skillet, but refusing to rise. The ring sat in the center of this dead, boiling circle, unmoving, untouched by the waves. Then the light in my shack changed again. The bulb overhead dimmed, the yellow filament turning a sickly red. The shadows that had been stretching across the floor vanished. In her cockpit, she was screaming about the light. She said the sun had been erased. The glow coming from the ring was not casting beams, it was eating the darkness. "There are no shadows in here," she gasped. "Fred's face, it's just light. Under the seat, under the dash, everything is bright. It's coming through the floor." I looked at my own hands. The skin looked translucent, waxy and pale under the failing bulb. The equipment on the desk, the heavy metal boxes that held the radio tubes, began to tick. It was the sound of metal expanding rapidly. I reached out to adjust the frequency dial, thinking I was losing her, and I pulled my hand back with a hiss. The knob was hot. Not warm, but hot. It seared the tips of my fingers instantly. I looked at the black bakelite. It was smoking slightly, not from fire, but from an intense, internal heat. The wires running along the wall began to twitch, snaking against the wood like living vines. "It's bigger than Howland," she said, her voice trembling with the scale of it. "It is wider than the island. It is rotating." She described the motion. The ring was not drifting with the current. It was spinning on its axis, a slow, majestic revolution that disturbed nothing around it. It turned silently, a wheel of silver fire grinding against the air. She said looking at it made her dizzy, that the spinning seemed to pull her eyes out of her head. It was a movement that belonged to a machine, but it was too smooth, too perfect. There was no wobble, no vibration in the water. It was just there, dominating the ocean, turning with a purpose that felt ancient. I stood up, backing away from the desk. The heat radiating from the radio was hitting me in waves now, dry and blistering. It felt like opening an oven door. The musty paper of the logbook on the desk began to curl up, the edges turning brown. The ink of my fresh writing shimmered and dried instantly. "The sky," she moaned. "The blue is gone. It's bruised." I ran to the window and looked out. The sky over Hawaii was still the bright, hard blue of the afternoon. But through the radio, I was seeing what she saw. She described the heavens above the ring turning a violent, deep purple. It wasn't the purple of a sunset. It was the color of a fresh injury, dark and swollen. The clouds that had been glowing were now being sucked into that color, dissolving into a bruised haze. The world she was flying in was no longer the world I was standing in. She had crossed a line on the map that no cartographer had ever drawn. "It's beautiful," she whispered. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. "It's so bright." The heat in the shack became unbearable. My shirt stuck to my chest, but the sweat wasn't cooling me. It felt like I was standing inside a bell jar that was being slowly lowered into a fire. The radio hummed, a low, angry note that vibrated in my teeth. The ring was down there, miles away, yet its power was reaching through the wire, through the air, burning everything it touched. I watched the needle on the temperature gauge for the transmitter bury itself in the red. The glass face of the gauge cracked with a sharp tink, a spiderweb fracture appearing over the numbers. I wanted to cut the power. I wanted to rip the cords from the wall and kill the connection before the heat cooked me alive. But I couldn't. Her voice was the only thing anchoring her to the earth, and I was the one holding the line. If I let go, she was gone. So I stood there, skin blistering in the dry heat, listening to her describe the spinning crown of silver that was waiting to swallow her whole. The screaming started then. It was not the scream of a woman in pain, but the frantic, confused cry of a pilot whose machine had betrayed her. Through the static and the grinding noise, I heard the wind die. The roar of the air rushing over the fuselage, the sound that had been the background of her transmission for hours, simply vanished. It did not fade away as if she had slowed down. It was cut off, as if the air itself had been turned into stone. "We are stuck," she yelled. "We are not moving. The wind is gone." I tried to understand what she was saying. A plane cannot stop in the sky. If the engines fail, it glides. If the wings lose the air, it falls like a stone. But she was not falling. She was suspended. She described the propellers, those twin spinning blurs that had pulled her across the ocean. She said they had frozen solid. They hadn't spun down or sputtered to a halt. They had locked instantly mid-turn, standing stiff and still against the sky. Yet the plane did not dip its nose. It hung there, pinned against the clouds like a moth trapped in a spider's web. "The stick won't move," she gasped. "It's heavy, it's like the controls are welded to the floor." I could hear the struggle in her voice, the physical exertion of hauling back on a yoke that refused to budge. She was wrestling with a phantom grip. In my shack, the invisible force arrived with a violence that made me jump. The metal typewriter on the side table groaned, sliding across the wood with a screech. It slammed into the base of the radio receiver. The handful of loose nails I kept in a glass jar flew upward, hitting the ceiling with a rattle like hail, and stayed there. They were clustered against the tin roof, quivering, magnetized by a power that was surging through the very earth. I reached for the tuning knob, and a spark the size of a man's thumb leaped from the metal casing. It snapped against my hand, a bite of blue fire that left a welt on my skin. I recoiled, falling back into my chair. The radio was no longer just hot. It was alive with energy. Tiny arcs of lightning danced between the copper terminals. The wood of the desk where the receiver sat began to turn black, smoking under the intense electrical pressure. Then came the voices. "Let us go," Amelia begged. "Please, let us go." But when she spoke, she was not alone. As her words came through the speaker, a second sound layered over them. It was a deep, resonating thrum, a vibration that mimicked her speech perfectly. Every syllable she uttered was doubled by this lower, heavier tone. It sounded like a choir of deep pipes speaking in unison with her, mocking her, or perhaps keeping her company. It was a mechanical harmony, void of any pity. "They are pulling us," the double voice said, the two tones weaving together into a discordant noise that made my head swim. The water is reaching up." I stared at the wall, my vision blurring. I could see what she was describing as clearly as if I were sitting in the navigator's seat. The ocean, which had been boiling flat within the ring, was no longer content to stay below. She screamed that the sea was rising. It wasn't a wave. It was a column. A solid pillar of dark water was lifting out of the center of the ring, defying gravity, reaching up toward the belly of her plane. She said the water looked like black glass. It rose smoothly, without a splash, a massive finger of the ocean extending upward to touch the sky. The plane was being drawn toward it. The invisible tether was reeling them in, dragging the silver Electra sideways through the air toward that rising tower of liquid. "It's got us," she cried. And the deep voice under hers boomed the same words, shaking the speaker mesh. "It's reeling us in like a fish on a line." I grabbed the edge of the desk, ignoring the heat, ignoring the way the hair on my arms stood straight up in the charged air. I shouted into the dead microphone. I told her to fight. I told her to cut the switches. But I knew she couldn't hear me. The connection was now a tunnel for the thing in the water. The sparks from the receiver were flying constantly now, a shower of blue and white fire that lit up the dim room. The air smelled sharp, like a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. I watched the needle on the signal strength gauge wrap itself all the way around the pin and snap off. The force holding her plane was bleeding into my world, turning my station into a lightning rod. "We are sliding," she whispered, the dual voice making it sound like a chant. "We are sliding toward the pillar." The sensation of the pull was so strong, I felt it in my own chest. I felt a tug behind my navel, a lurching sensation as if the gravity in Hawaii was tilting toward that spot in the ocean. I gripped the chair, planting my boots on the floorboards, fighting a phantom vertigo. I was miles away, safe on dry land. But in that moment, I felt the sickening lurch of the slide, the helpless drift into the center of the trap. The tether was tight, and it was dragging us both into the unknown. The world did not end with a bang. It ended with a light that had no business existing in a universe of men and mud. The pillar of water that had risen to meet the plane did not crash down. It split open. I was listening to the grinding roar of the ocean through the headset, waiting for the sound of the impact, waiting for the crunch of the Electra being crushed by the sea. Instead, the noise cut out. It was replaced by a low, resonant hum that vibrated the very fillings in my teeth. And then, the receiver on my desk exploded with light. I do not mean it sparked. I mean the vacuum tubes, those glass bulbs that usually glowed with a dull, friendly orange warmth, flared a brilliant, blinding white. It was as if someone had stuffed a piece of the sun inside each glass casing. I threw my hands up to cover my face, but the light was so intense it went right through my fingers. I could see the bones of my hand, dark shadows sketched against the red curtain of my eyelids. "It is opening," Amelia said. Her voice was different now. The dual tone was gone. The panic was gone. She sounded like she was speaking from the bottom of a deep well, distant and muffled. "The sun," she whispered. "There is a second sun inside the water." I squinted through my fingers. The shack was awash in a stark, clinical whiteness. It washed out the shadows. It flattened the depth of the room. The corners of the desk, the curves of the chair, everything looked two-dimensional, like a drawing made on a piece of paper. The heat was gone, replaced by a numbness that tingled on my skin, the way your arm feels when the blood flow is cut off. She told me the light was filling the cockpit. She said the dials on the dashboard were invisible because the light was brighter than the radium paint. She couldn't see Fred anymore. She couldn't see her own hands on the stick. There was only the whiteness. It was a solid thing, a fog of brilliance that dissolved distance. "There are shapes in the light," she said. My heart hammered against my ribs. A trapped, bird. What shapes? I croaked, though I knew the microphone was dead to her. Tall, she murmured. So tall. They are thin as reeds. They are standing on the air. She described them with a terrifying lack of fear. She said they were pale, like the bellies of deep-sea fish. They had no faces, just smooth, blank surfaces where eyes should be. They were drifting through the blinding glare, circling the plane, moving with a fluid grace that defied the wind. They were not flying. They were swimming through the light. I looked at the clock on the wall of the shack. The second hand was twitching. It moved forward, then jerked back, then moved forward again. It was fighting to tick. Time felt thick in the room. I tried to lift my hand to adjust the volume, but my arm moved through the air as if I were underwater. A simple motion took seconds. I watched the dust motes dancing in the beam of light from the window. They were frozen in midair, suspended in the amber of a broken moment. They are touching the glass, Amelia said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the human instinct to recoil. Their fingers are long. They have too many joints. I could hear a faint, high-pitched scratching sound over the transmission. It sounded like diamond cutters dragging across a pane of glass. It was the sound of something trying to get in, or perhaps something testing the seal of a container. Don't let them in, I whispered to the empty room. For God's sake, don't let them in. But she wasn't listening to fear anymore. A strange, drugged calm had settled over her. It was the calm of a patient who has been given the heavy medicine before the surgery begins. She was observing her own doom with the detachment of a scientist looking at a bug in a jar. The ocean is gone, she stated simply. I blinked, trying to clear the spots from my vision. What do you mean gone? I thought. The water, it pulled back, she continued, her voice drifting. It isn't water down there. It is a city. No, a machine. It is all silver. Valleys of silver. Mountains of gears. She described a landscape that replaced the Pacific. The blue waves had dissolved, revealing a hard, metallic surface beneath. She spoke of shifting geometric shapes, vast plates of iron that slid over one another like the scales of a serpent. There was no horizon, only this endless mechanical terrain that stretched out in all directions, illuminated by the cold, white fire of the ring. It is beautiful, she sighed, and the sound of her breath was loud in my ear. It is so much cleaner than the earth. The light in my shack began to pulse. It throbbed in time with her breathing. Every time she inhaled, the room flared brighter. Every time she exhaled, it dimmed slightly. I was linked to her. My reality was being rewritten by hers. The logbook on my desk was blank. The words I had written, the coordinates, the panic, the timestamps, had faded. The paper was white and empty. I realized then that the sun had not risen at midnight. We had been taken somewhere where the sun did not matter. The light wasn't coming from a star. It was coming from the gate, and it was washing us clean, erasing the stain of where we came from. She was floating over a world of silver, and I was drowning in the light, thousands of miles away. I have felt the drop of an elevator when the cable snaps in a nightmare. I have felt the lurch of a ship when it crests a rogue wave and the ocean disappears from beneath the hull. But I had never felt the earth simply let go. It started in the pit of my stomach. It was a sickness, a sudden, violent vertigo that told my brain I was falling. I grabbed the arms of my chair, bracing for an impact. But I wasn't falling down. My feet felt light on the floorboards. The heavy military boots I wore, usually dragging with the weight of mud and duty, felt like they were filled with helium. I looked at the desk. The heavy metal punch press used for the logbook sheets hovered an inch above the wood. It drifted there, rotating slowly, untethered from the world. "We are falling," Amelia whispered. "But we are falling away." Her voice was no longer coming from a terrified woman. It was coming from a ghost. She described the cockpit with a child's wonder. She said the flight maps were floating around her head like large, pale moths. The pencils, the thermos, the navigator's protractor, they were all drifting up toward the canopy glass. She was hanging against her harness straps, her shoulders pressed hard into the leather. But the pressure was coming from below, not above. "The sea is getting smaller," she said. "We are leaving it." I tried to understand. A plane climbs by fighting the air, by clawing its way up. But she wasn't climbing. The engines were dead. The propellers were frozen bars of steel. She was being lifted. The entire craft was being plucked from the atmosphere like a toy from a sandbox. The silver ring, that crown of fire in the water, was repelling her. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps the sky had opened a mouth and was sucking her in. "The horizon," she murmured. And for the first time, a note of true madness crept into her tone. "It is bending. It is curling up." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to visualize the geometry she was describing. "The horizon is a line. It is the edge of the world. It stays flat or it curves gently away." But she said the ends of the earth were rising. The line of the metallic ocean was curving upward on both sides, wrapping around her. The world was folding itself into a bowl, and she was rising from the center of it. "It is a circle," she said. "The world is a closed circle." The static on the radio changed then. The grinding noise was gone. The high-pitched whine was gone. In their place came a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a thump. Thump, 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 thump. It was rhythmic, wet, and heavy. It sounded like a heartbeat. But it was too slow, too massive, to belong to anything living. It was the heartbeat of a machine the size of a mountain. It boomed through the speaker, shaking the dust from the ceiling rafters. Thump, thump. "I see the door," she said. She wasn't looking down at the ocean anymore. She was looking up. And what she saw was not the stars. She described a void, a perfect circular patch of absolute blackness hanging in the center of the bruised purple sky. It was a hole in the fabric of the night. It had no depth, no reflection. It was just an absence, a place where the light went to die. "It is waiting for us," she whispered. I lunged for the microphone. I had to stop her. I had to scream at her to dive, to crash, to do anything but go into that dark circle. I grabbed the metal stick of the mic, but it burned me. Not with heat this time. It burned with cold. It was the freezing burn of dry ice. It stuck to my skin. I tore my hand away, leaving a patch of raw flesh on the metal. The microphone was dead. The little red light that showed I was transmitting was dark. The wires were coated in a sudden layer of white frost. The connection was still open. I could hear the heartbeat. I could hear her breathing. But I could not speak. I was muted by the void. "We are going in," she said. Her voice was small, swallowed by the vastness of the thing. It's not black inside. The transmission dissolved into a roar. It wasn't static. It was the sound of a roaring fire, a blast furnace operating at full capacity. The thump-thump of the mechanical heart accelerated, faster and faster, until it became a single, continuous drum roll of thunder. I watched the frequency needle on my receiver. It didn't just redline, it twisted. The metal arm of the needle bent into a hook, curling back on itself as if trying to hide from the signal it was receiving. The light in the room died. The bulb overhead shattered, raining glass down on my head. But the room wasn't dark. A pale, silver luminescence leaked from the radio speaker itself, casting long, twisted shadows against the wall. "Amelia!" I screamed into the dead room. "Amelia!" But she was gone. The plane had entered the center of the silver fire. The descent was over. They had fallen upwards, out of the map, out of the history books, and into the throat of the thing that lived between the stars. The roar reached a crescendo, a sound so loud it wasn't heard, but felt. A shock wave that rattled the bones in my chest. And then, as quickly as the earth had let go, the gravity returned. The punch press slammed down onto the desk. My boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. The world snapped back into place, but it felt wrong. It felt lighter, thinner, as if something vital had been stolen from the air. The roar that had shaken the walls did not fade away like a passing storm. It did not rumble into the distance. It ended with a shriek. It was a sound so high and thin that it felt like a needle being driven into the center of my ear. The glass face of the pressure gauge on the wall exploded, showering the floor with jagged shards. But I did not hear them hit the wood. The high-pitched scream from the speaker had deafened me to everything else, a violent, piercing note that scraped the inside of my skull. Then, the wire went dead. The silence that followed was not the peace of a quiet room. It was a physical blow. It slammed into the shack, heavier and thicker than the air had been a moment before. It was the silence of a deep cave, the kind of quiet that hurts because your ears strain for a sound that isn't there. The humming of the transformer was gone. The buzzing of the flies against the window screen was gone. The world had been struck mute. I stared at the radio receiver. A moment ago, it had been a living thing, pulsing with light and voices from the other side of reality. Now, it was just a cold metal box. The dials on the front panel were spinning wildly, the needles whipping back and forth like trapped insects trying to escape a jar. They spun left, then right, burying themselves against the pins before collapsing. One by one, they fell limp, pointing straight down, dead and useless. The orange glow in the vacuum tubes flickered once, a dying heartbeat, and then went black. I tried to stand up. I wanted to run to the door, to shout for the guards, to fire a flare gun, to do anything that would break the spell. But my body refused to obey. The connection between my mind and my legs had been severed. I sat there, gripping the edge of the desk with white knuckles, but my boots felt like they were filled with lead. A cold, tingling paralysis had gripped me from the waist down. It was as if the numbness of the void she had entered had traveled back through the signal and settled in my marrow. I was anchored to the chair, a statue of flesh and bone. The horror of the silence grew. It wasn't just the radio. I realized with a sudden, sick lurch in my gut that the world outside the shack had stopped too. This station was surrounded by jungle. Day and night, the air was filled with the chatter of birds, the sawing of crickets, the rustle of the wind in the palms, and the distant rhythmic crash of the Pacific surf. It was a noise so constant you stopped hearing it until it was gone. But now, there was nothing. No bird called out, no leaf rustled. The ocean, which had been beating against the shore for 1,000,000 years, had fallen silent. It felt as though the island had been encased in glass. The life of the world had been paused, holding its breath in terror at what had just happened in the sky. I strained to hear the waves, but there was only the rushing of my own blood in my ears, loud and frantic. I looked at the headset lying on the desk where it had fallen. It looked harmless now, just loops of wire and black plastic. But I knew what had come through it. I watched it, waiting for it to hiss, waiting for the static to return. Then, there was one final sign. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a roar. It was a pulse of pure force. The headset jumped. It leapt inches into the air as if kicked by an invisible boot, then clattered back down onto the wood. A single, sharp pop echoed in the room, like a stone cracking in a fire. And then, the sensation hit me. I felt the presence withdraw. For the last hour, the air in the room had felt crowded, occupied by something vast and unseen that was watching me from the ceiling, from the corners, from the spaces between the atoms. Now, that presence ripped itself away. I felt a suction in the room, a sudden vacuum that pulled at my clothes and my hair, dragging everything upward. It was the feeling of a massive weight lifting off my chest. The atmosphere in the shack, which had been charged and electric, suddenly went flat and stale. The thing that had been waiting in the static was gone. It had taken what it came for. It had taken the silver plane, the woman, and the navigator, and it had retreated back into the black hole above the clouds. I was left alone in the wreckage of the quiet, paralyzed in a wooden box, listening to a world that was too afraid to make a sound. The silence was a weight, but the heat was a weapon. I thought the withdrawal of that massive presence would bring relief, a cooling of the air. But I was wrong. The energy that had passed through the station did not just leave. It soaked into the walls. It saturated the wood and the iron. The room began to bake. It was not the wet, heavy warmth of the tropics that I was used to. This was a dry, stinging heat, the kind that radiates from a stove that has been left on for days. It pushed against my eyes and dried the moisture from my tongue in seconds. I looked at the radio receiver. The vacuum tubes were dead and black, but the metal casing around them was changing. A dull, angry color began to bleed through the gray steel. It turned a deep, throbbing cherry red. The metal was glowing. It was radiating a fever so intense. I had to push my chair back, scraping the floorboards just to keep the skin on my face from blistering. The wires that ran from the back of the set to the wall were trembling, not from a breeze, but from the sheer violence of the temperature rising inside the copper. On the desk, the logbook, the only proof I had of what had happened, began to die. I watched, helpless, as the corners of the pages curled up. They turned brittle and brown, aging 50 years in a few seconds. There was no flame. There was no smoke to cloud the air. It was a clean, invisible incineration. The paper simply gave up. The writing, the frantic notes I had made about the coordinates and the silver ring, faded into the darkening pulp. The heat was erasing the history before I could even understand it. I raised my hand to shield my eyes from the glow of the machine. And that was when I saw my own skin. My sleeves were rolled up, and the flesh of my forearms was angry and red. It looked raw, as if I had fallen asleep under the noon sun on the hottest day of the year. But I had been inside. I had been in the shade. The light from the second sun, the light that had swallowed the plane, had traveled through the voice, through the wire, and burned me from miles away. I touched my face. My cheeks felt tight and hot, distinctively swollen. I was a man who had been burned by a ghost. I tried to stand again, and this time my legs obeyed, but the world did not. A wave of sickness crashed over me, violent and sudden. It wasn't just nausea. It was a distortion of balance. The floor seemed to tilt 45 degrees to the left. I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from sliding, though the room was perfectly flat. My inner ear was screaming that I was spinning, that I was upside down. It felt as though the island itself had been knocked off its axis by the force of the departure. I retched, dry and painful, my body trying to reject the wrongness of the physics around me. As I hung there, gripping the wood, I heard a skittering sound on the floor. It sounded like rats scratching on the planks. I looked down. It wasn't animals. It was metal. The loose screws, the dropped paper clips, the tin cup I had knocked over. They were moving. They were sliding across the floorboards, drawn together by an invisible magnetism. They clumped together in the center of the room, forming a jagged metallic knot. The fillings in my teeth buzzed with a dull ache. The air in the room was so charged that the hair on my arm stood rigid, and when I moved my hand, I could feel the resistance, like wading through thick water. I looked up at the wall, searching for something familiar, something that made sense. I looked at the station clock. It was a standard issue naval timepiece, round and white with black numbers. It had never lost a second. Now, it was dead. The second hand was frozen. The minute hand was locked. I stared at the time. It had stopped at the exact moment the transmission cut, to that high-pitched shriek. The mechanism hadn't just wound down, it had fused. The heat or the magnetic grip had welded the gears together. Time had officially stopped in the shack. Outside, the sun might have been moving. The world might have been turning. But in here, we were trapped in the moment of the abduction. The heat beat down on me. The red glow of the radio pulsed like a dying star, and the pile of metal scrap on the floor twitched and settled. I was the only living thing left in a room that had been touched by the void, and I felt marked. I felt that if I walked out that door, I would never truly step back into the same world I had left that morning. The door did not open. It burst inward. The wooden latch shattered with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot, sending splinters flying across the room to mix with the magnetized scrap on the floor. I was still gripping the table, fighting the sickness in my gut, when the jungle air rushed in. But it wasn't the relief I had hoped for. The air was filled with dust and the smell of hot engines. It had been less than 5 minutes since the signal died. That was the first thing that terrified me, even before they spoke. The main garrison was 10 miles down the coast. The airfield was 20 minutes away by jeep on a good road. But these men were here instantly. They hadn't scrambled. They had been waiting. They must have been sitting in the tall grass just beyond the perimeter wire, engines idling in the dark, checking their watches, waiting for the exact second the event concluded. Men poured into the shack. They moved with a speed and violence that felt rehearsed. They were not the island garrison. They were not the sleepy, sweat-stained boys I played cards with in the evenings. These men wore crisp, dark uniforms without insignias, and others wore heavy wool suits that had no place in the Pacific heat. Their faces were dry. While I stood there dripping with sweat and nursing my burns, they looked as cold and hard as the iron of a ship's hull. One of them, a man with eyes like polished stones, marched straight to the desk. He didn't look at me. He didn't check to see if I was injured, though my skin was visibly red and blistering. He reached out with a gloved hand and snatched the logbook. The pages were still hot, curled and brown from the impossible heat of the transmission, but he shoved it into a leather satchel without hesitation. He swept the wax recording cylinders off the shelf, dropping them into a padded metal case held open by another man. The efficiency of it was terrifying. They weren't searching. They knew exactly where everything was. "Grab the operator," the man in the suit said. His voice was flat, bored even. Two pairs of hands grabbed my arms. They were strong, hurting the burned skin. They hauled me back from the desk, dragging me toward the wall. I tried to speak, to tell them about the ring, about the water that rose like a pillar, but the words caught in my dry throat. "She's gone," I managed to croak. "The sky took her." The man in the suit turned slowly to look at me. He stepped closer, invading my space until I could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. He didn't look confused. He didn't ask what I meant. He looked annoyed. "You heard nothing," he said. It wasn't a question. "You heard atmospheric interference. You heard a pilot disoriented by exhaustion. You heard the engines fail due to lack of fuel." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "The fuel was full." She said. He struck me. It was a sharp, backhanded slap across the face that snapped my head to the side. "You heard static?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You are a soldier. You know what treason is. Speaking of things that do not exist is treason." I slumped against the wall, my head ringing. Through the haze, I watched the rest of them dismantling my station. They didn't just unplug the radio. They were afraid of it. I saw two men wearing thick, heavy aprons that looked like lead dragging a large crate into the room. They used long tongs to grip the radio receiver. The metal was still glowing, that dull, angry cherry red, radiating heat that made the air shimmer. They dropped the machine into the crate and slammed the lid, sealing it with heavy latches. They treated it like a bomb or like a piece of the sun that had fallen to Earth. "Get the shielding," one of them muttered. "The readings are off the scale. It's leaking." "Is it Aquila?" another voice asked from the doorway. It was a hushed, hurried whisper. "Did the gate open?" "Shut your mouth," the suit snapped without turning around. "Load it up. We have 12 minutes before the perimeter is secured." Aquila. The gate. The words floated in the humid air, heavy with meaning I couldn't grasp. They knew. They hadn't come to rescue a lost flyer. They had come to clean up a spill. They had been waiting for this. They knew about the ring in the water. They knew about the silver fire. Amelia wasn't an explorer to them. She was bait. Or maybe she was just a canary sent into a mine to see if the gas would kill her. I was shoved toward the door, stumbling over the threshold. The sunlight outside was blinding after the strange, artificial whiteness of the event. I saw the line of jeeps, the engines idling. They were parked in a formation that suggested they had been there for hours, hidden under the canopy, just out of sight of my window. There were no medics. There were no search planes warming up on the runway. There was just a convoy of dark vehicles waiting to carry the evidence away. The man in the suit stopped in the doorway, looking back at the empty spot on the desk where the radio had been. The wood was scorched black, the outline of the receiver burned into the grain. He looked at me one last time, and I saw a flicker of something behind his stone eyes. It wasn't pity. It was fear. He was afraid of what had been in that room. He was afraid of the heat that was still radiating from my skin. "She crashed," he said. And this time he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "The ocean is big. We will never find the wreckage. That is the truth. That is the only truth you will ever speak, if you want to live to see your home again." They threw me into the back of a truck, pulling a canvas sheet down to block my view. I sat in the dark, the smell of gasoline and hot iron filling my nose, listening to the sound of my life being erased. The radio was gone. The logbook was gone. The silence of the jungle returned, but it was a lie now. The real noise, The heartbeat of the machine that lived in the sky was still out there, beating in the void. And I was the only one left who knew the rhythm. They did not kill me. Killing a man leaves a body, and a body asks questions. Instead, they buried me. They transferred me to a listening post in the middle of the Dust Bowl, a concrete bunker buried 20 feet beneath the wheat. There are no windows here. There is no ocean. There is only the hum of the ventilation fans and the endless dry silence of the earth pressing in on all sides. They told me it was a promotion. They told me I needed a quiet place to recover from my breakdown. But I know what this is. It is a hole where they throw the things they cannot destroy, but cannot allow to be seen. I look at my arms under the harsh fluorescent lights of the basement. The skin is still wrong. It has been years. Yet the red, shiny patches where the heat of the wire touched me have not faded. They do not tan. They do not sweat. When the weather changes, when a storm rolls in over the plains above, the scars itch with a deep, burning memory. They know when the air pressure drops. They remember the feeling of the vacuum. The doctors here give me cream and tell me it is a nervous condition, a rash born of stress. But I know better. It is the mark of the gate. I was touched by the light of that second sun, and it left a piece of itself inside my blood. I watched the newsreels when they finally declared her dead. I saw the ships crisscrossing the Pacific, the planes flying low over the waves. The public wept. They called it a tragedy of the age. But I sat in the back of the theater in the dark, and I laughed until the usher threatened to throw me out. It was a play. It was a performance. I saw the maps they used in the news. I saw the coordinates where they said they were searching. They were hundreds of miles south of where she screamed. They didn't want to find her. They wanted to make sure no one else did. They sent the Navy to the empty water to make a show of looking. While the real ships, the gray ones without flags, circled the spot where the Silver Crown had risen. They know it is there. They are guarding it. They are waiting for it to open again. Sometimes, late at night, when the other operators are asleep in the barracks, I sneak into the comms room. I shouldn't be there. If they catch me, I will disappear for good this time. But I have to know. I built a small receiver, a mess of copper wire and stolen parts, hidden inside a hollowed-out book. It isn't powerful enough to send, but it can listen. I tune it to the frequency that doesn't exist on the official bands. I tune it to the dead space between the stations, and I listen to the static. Most nights, it is just the hiss of the stars. But sometimes, when the moon is new and the sky is dark, I hear it. I hear the thump-thump. It is faint, buried deep under the noise of the atmosphere. But it is there. The heartbeat of the machine. The rhythm of the great silver gears turning in the void. And I hear her. She is not screaming anymore. She is not asking for a bearing. Her voice is a whisper, woven into the fabric of the static. She recites numbers. She recites star charts that do not match our sky. She speaks of the pale children and the cities of glass that hang in the endless twilight. She sounds cold. She sounds hollow. She did not die in the water. That would have been a mercy. To drown is to end. But she was taken through the sky door. She was pulled up into that bruise-colored heaven, and she is still there, flying in the grip of the silver ring. She has become part of their collection. I have realized the truth that keeps me awake while the others sleep. I used to think we were the explorers. I used to think we were the masters of this earth, conquering the air and the sea with our engines and our radios. But we are not the masters. We are the livestock. The ring in the water was not a ship. It was a trough. It was a gate used by the farmers who live above the sky. They come down when they please. They take what they want. A plane, a woman, a navigator. And they leave us confused and terrified, scrambling to explain it with fuel gauges and storms. The government knows. The men in the dark suits, the ones who speak of Project Aquila, they are not trying to fight it. They are just the ranch hands. They keep the herd calm. They hide the evidence when one of us is taken, so the rest do not stampede. I turn off the radio. I hide the wire. I lie back on my cot and stare at the concrete ceiling, feeling the weight of the dirt above me. I am safe here, in my hole. But I know the gate remains open. I know the silver wheel is still turning, somewhere out in the dark water. And I know that one day, they will come back. Not for one plane, but for the rest of the herd. Until then, I rub the scars on my arms, and I wait for the silence to return.